Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's program. My name is Persis Karim. I am the director for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies at San Francisco State University. Today, we're really fortunate to host a reading and conversation with award-winning Iranian American novelist Azareen Vliet Oloomi. And we're delighted to have you with us from Indiana, is that right? And as well as Susan Perry, who comes to us more locally from the South Bay. Today, I want to say how much fun I had thinking about putting these two people into conversation, because in some ways they represent poles of, I think, an emerging literature of the Iranian diaspora, as well as what we now have more comfortably identified as an oeuvre of Iranian American literature. I wanted to put these two people into conversation, partly because they both address themes of history, migration, alienation in their own works, as well as in their work of engaging other authors. I'll briefly introduce the two of them, and then Azareen will read a short excerpt from Savage Tongues, which Joy Williams writes is a luxuriant, fevered quest for reclamation, political, poetical, and spooky good. Azareen will be in conversation with Susan, and then we'll open the floor around 30 to 40 minutes into the program, so that you in the audience can ask questions and kind of engage with Azareen and Susan. You can either put your question in the chat and I will attempt to identify it, or you can use that little icon, the hand, and we'll call on you. First, let me also say how much I appreciate you all being here, and I hope you'll follow the work of the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies as we engage in scholarship and research about the global Iranian diaspora, but also try to do public programs that invite those who enrich the conversation through the arts and culture. You can go to our website, ids.sfsu.edu, to learn more about the work we're doing and sign up for our newsletter. And also we have those wonderful social media platforms where you can follow our work. Azareen Vliet Oloomi is the author of the novels Call Me Zebra, Fra Keeler, and most recently Savage Tongues. Call Me Zebra won the PEN/Faulkner Award for Fiction, the John Gardner Award, and was longlisted for the PEN Open Book Award, and was named a best book by over 20 publications. She received a 2015 Whiting Writers Award and was a National Book Foundation 5 Under 35 honoree for her debut novel, Fra Keeler. Her work has been supported by a Fulbright Fellowship, a MacDowell Fellowship, a fellowship from Vliet Oloomi, and has appeared in her work has appeared in the Paris Review, Granta, Guernica, Baum, and the Los Angeles Review of Books, among other publications. Her novel Savage Tongues is pretty recently released from Houghton Mifflin Harcourt, and in 2022, her novella N, about Napoleon's exile in Elba, will be released by Coffeehouse Press as part of their Spatial Species series. That's a mouthful. She's also the founder of Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance, a biennial symposia and lecture series that focuses on the study of literatures that have been shaped by histories of migration, systemic violence, territorial and linguistic politics, extinction, and gross human rights violations. The series grapples with the constructed nature of history and reimagines American and global history from the position of suppressed voices. It also seeks to examine the relationship between ethics, aesthetics, and literature by discussing how texts by writers of color and minoritized writers that are sites of alternative knowledge production can innovate the technology of the novel and the poem in the process of responding to state-sanctioned violence. And then Susan Perry is the author of The Fortune Catcher, a novel about a young woman, American and Iranian, Jewish and Muslim, caught up in the aftermath of the 1979 Islamic Revolution. Susan is also a book reviewer, essayist, and interviewer, and most recently, she's been working with us as a volunteer editor for the Center for Iranian Diaspora Studies. You can read some of her nonfiction on her website, and her forthcoming novel, In the Time of Our History, will be published in January of 2023. And I should, of course, mention that we are living on occupied lands. In my case, the occupied lands of the Ohlone people. So I'm just going to acknowledge the loss and the occupation of those tribal lands where I reside, but we're all living on occupied lands. And also, I think it is our duty to support those young writers who are emerging from indigenous communities all over our continent. So thank you both for being here. And without further ado, I'm going to hand the mic over to the two of you. And I think we're going to start, is that right, Susan, with Azareen reading a short excerpt?
Actually, no, I'm going to wait on that. I'm first going to ask her, since the center is hosting this event. Azareen, would you mind first giving us some background about your mixed heritage?
Oh, sure. Well, thank you for hosting me, and to everyone in the audience for coming this evening. It's really wonderful to be here with you, and Suzanne for being in conversation with me. So yeah, my background is pretty mixed heritage. I'm half Iranian, and the other half is British via the Netherlands. And I, however, grew up very much immersed in Iranian culture. In a sort of very matriarchal Iranian home, speaking Farsi, and living in Iran and then migrating back to the United States. And so the way that I identify is very much as Iranian American. I don't deny my British or Dutch heritage, but I don't have an active relationship to it. So that is its own complicated space to occupy.
I understand. I was going to ask you that specifically, and you answered it for me, because I noticed that you use your mother's maiden name as your family name after your father's.
Yeah, that wasn't a choice that I made. It was a choice that my parents made together to have both of their last names represented.
Oh, that's great. Oh,
yeah.
Excellent. I had this idea that because it wasn't hyphenated, that you had made this decision and it was about your identity. No, and that kind of goes to show you that it says a lot about the character of my family, but also just the pride that they feel in being Iranian, and that I share. I think the quality of my pride might be a little bit different, but yeah, I'm very glad that I have that last name, and it makes me feel a lot more connected to my ancestry in a lot of ways. That's great. Okay. Well, I think what I'm going to do is ask you to read the opening paragraph of this wonderful book that I loved reading, and that addresses so many issues that, whether you're Iranian or not, we are all addressing and examining at this time.
Sure. So this is just straight from the beginning of the novel. 20 years had passed since I'd been to Marbella. 20 years, I repeated to myself as the plane descended through the sky towards Spain. I leaned my head against the plexiglass. The cool surface felt good against my forehead. I could see the mountains in the distance covered in a forbidding veil of mist. We'd flown through the night, now dawn was breaking. An uncertain yellow light was coming through the pillowy masses of clouds. Wrapped in fog, the ring of mountains looked muted and dull. Only their peaks glowed in the hushed, smoky tones of the sky. Below, I could see airplanes lined up on the black belt of the runway waiting to take off. Closer to the gates, there were tourists deplaning, leaning into the wind, their hair blown back, the turbines on the regional planes still spinning. The drone of the slowing engines echoed in my ears. I had the uneasy feeling that time had come to a standstill, that all of Marbella had existed in a state of suspension since I had last been there at 17, raw, restless, with a savage temperament that had led me into Omar's arms. Omar, my stepmother's nephew. Omar, my lover, my torturer, my confidant and enemy. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. So for those of you who haven't read the novel, I hope your interest is piqued. I know mine was. This is a story that I found very interesting in the way you approached it. Not entirely the way a Western writer would approach it in a solidly linear way, but more in sort of the Middle Eastern way of examining very deeply and connecting the personal to the historical and the political. So this young woman who is now 38, Arzu is her name, she experienced a summer of, I don't want to say sexual abuse, because that sometimes people have, well, I will say it because I think it's a complex issue, and it's not, the same for everyone. But she has a relationship with this stepmother's nephew who is 40 years old to her 17. So many people would consider that a kind of sexual abuse, as would I, but it's more complex. She's returning very bravely to the scene of the crime to somehow find a way toward healing from her trauma. Perhaps she spent many, many years thinking that it was over and being silent about it. A great deal of this is about silence. And she doesn't want to be silent anymore. Not necessarily does she want to tell everyone what happened to her, but she wants to understand it with language. And she thinks that may help her heal. And in addition to doing that, she invites her closest friend to join her in Marbella to help her through this, which I found so beautiful and so real, because I don't think we can get through these traumas without our closest friends. So what I would like to ask you is, what made you decide to write this story as a kind of a healing story rather than a revenge story or just a depiction of the horrific and complex thing that she went through?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's a very complicated question. And I think aesthetically, had I decided to tell this story in a way that was more linear or more inclined toward rage and kind of vengeance, as you said, it would likely hew closer to certain aesthetic modalities that we can call, Western, for lack of a better word. And I was really interested in the quality of the friendship between these two women, one who's, sort of, you could say ex-Muslim, and the other comes from a very Orthodox Jewish family from Israel, who is a, very committed Palestinian activist and a translator of Arabic literature, and is disowned by her own family due to her politics. And her life then spins out into episodes of sexual abuse in her youth as she learns how to navigate the world. And the same is true for the narrator, who, witnesses her brother be attacked in a very horrific, attack by a white supremacist teenager. And it's the act of witnessing that attack in the American landscape that then causes her to want to self-destruct and she understands at her 17 years of age that, you know, there's a power dynamic with Omar, but she underestimates just how cruel that power dynamic can be and how charged it can be, because she's so eager to kind of both destroy herself and also come into her full power as a sexually awakened teenage female, right? And because of the repression that she experiences, and I think a lot of women in our culture have been encouraged to remain, you know, sexually repressed, the biggest kind of act of coming into herself is, she thinks, is through having sex and through engaging in these behaviors that end up both being generative for her, but also suppressive in the future of healing or well-being. And I wanted to tell her story and Ellie's story, because if this was a story about revenge, it would be a story about Omar and Omar's forever effect on on her, and then, you know, sexual violence's effects on women in general. And I just wasn't interested in his story, you know, in giving him more space than he needed to have. And what I was really trying to explore is like, how does these experiences of sexual abuse and violence reshape our sense of language? How do they reshape our sense of narrative, where a story begins and ends, and then how we interact, you know, how we form notions of collective and individual identity? And that's a much more quiet and complicated story to tell, right? So it's a long answer, but I think
No, it's not.
no shortcut for why I made that decision, because it was a very difficult decision to make, you know.
Right. I mean, that's what I loved about this book, was that it was so complex, because that's the reality. In fact, this was for me closer to reality than so many tell-all abuse stories, because it does focus on, well, where do we go from here on our own, instead of constantly bringing the men who abused us with us.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, moving forward. And the friendship aspect of it was just beautiful from the beginning, where they identify with one another simply based on, you'd think in American terms, you know, these are opposites: Muslim, Jewish, sorry, I say Muslim still, Muslim, Jewish, Iranian, Israeli. So opposites, or opposing entities, as Americans would see them. But no, the main issue is that they are mixed, and they have been trying very hard to find themselves and find their voices. And so that's what brings them together. And that's what I think is something that so many of us now are having to deal with, because so many more of us are mixed. So I really like that. And I love the fact that you didn't want this to be Omar's story. I also like that you didn't include a lot of the sexual acts or specifics, though there are some very poignant ones and some very violent ones. But your character, Arezou, feels both eroticism and fear, repugnance and love, lust. This is reality, you know, it's not binary. So I really loved that. And this issue of the opposite thing, the opposite girls, the women who are opposites as girls and then as women. So I want to ask you, would you consider this a journey story?
Yeah, I would, absolutely. I mean, on the subject of opposites, like, I was also really interested in these opposing poles of emotion that she feels, where she's extremely fragile, but also really fierce. She's like afraid of being neglected or abandoned, but then she's also completely independent in a lot of ways. And just that those those are, you know, false binaries, of course. And I was just interested in kind of bringing all of these contradictions into one story, one body. And yeah, I think I lost track of your question though, the
Yeah.
question at the end.
I can't remember. Oh, was this a journey story? Yeah.
A journey story. Yeah, I'm really interested in this notion of pilgrimage. I mean, that's all over my second novel too, Call Me Zebra, where it's a lot funnier, but also a story of exile and war. And but I was just remembering, as we were talking earlier, that every time my grandmother would start a story, it was always, oh, back then when things were great, you know.
Yeah.
And my family was very focused on looking in the rearview mirror. And I think that was part of the extreme grief and sense of loss from the revolution and the shock of it. So you know, we all know when it happened, but you know, having, you know, my khales and dais and my mom like be in their 20s and sort of fully formed and expecting reality to look some way, right? Having been trained for a certain reality, and then having that reality be completely derailed and not having built up the resources that we usually build up in our youth to cope, right? And I think it was that feeling of not just displacement, but also being cut off and shut out of the world that they knew, that caused them to always be looking to the past and somewhat dangerously nostalgic, right? And perhaps even idealizing or romanticizing certain things. But it's you know, it's that once upon a time kind of, that's how I learned to tell stories, because that's how stories were told to me. And
yeah,
yeah, exactly. So I'm always just interested in what does it mean to look back. But you know, the way that I experienced it in life was this looking back that led to stuckness and led to status and staticness and a lot of despair. And what for me as a writer, I've tried to really use the energy of looking back, but then make a transformational use out of it to say, well, I have to look back. We have to look back, but we can't just sink there, you know? So this is also a story of a return where they're looking at the most horrifying thing right in the eye and then being like, well, I'm going to walk through this landscape willingly, and I'm going to figure out how to get out. And I'm not going to deny that it happened or stay inside of it for the rest of my life. And I think it's probably a way that I learned how to feel empowered, coming from a family culture that was somewhat disempowered as a result of historical events and personalities, right? It's always a convergence of factors.
I agree.
Yeah.
I am part of that generation that they call the burnt generation. So when the revolution happened, I was about 21. And I have a whole host of friends and family who I think of it as their futures were stolen. And some of them were able to move forward. A lot of them were not able to move forward. And so the looking back issue, you know, the thing is, yeah, you get stuck. I think I've decided that it's really important to look back, but to not look back immediately. So in other words, wait, move forward. And for me, it's usually 10 to 20 years. If I look back 20 years ago, I can understand better what happened to me and to the world if I have that distance. But if you stay in the past for those 20 years, then the world hasn't changed for you, and the understanding is not as keen, I think. So
yeah, I would agree. I mean, you need that distance. And
right, and Arzu, the main character in your book, it's 20 years. She goes back. I mean, my book, The Fortune Catcher About the Revolution, came out in 98, which was 20 years. My new book, it takes place 98, and it's, 2 years, 20 years. And it's just, there's a clarity for some reason in that distance. So I wanted to ask you, I'm sure a lot of people are interested in that, and I know we have a bunch of writers in the group. So I wanted to ask you about the writing of this book. As fiction writers, we often start with reality, or what some people call facts, which are basically an individual's view of the fact. And I know as a fiction writer, I start there, but very quickly I move into the story, and the characters morph and become fictionalized and are nothing like the person I think of when it starts. That might be myself or a family member. I know that this incident in the book with the brother of Arzu, where the skinhead beats him up, actually happened to your brother, and I understand that you feel that it's his story, not yours, and so you did incorporate this into the book. And I'm just wondering if you might want to talk a little bit about the process of how fiction comes to you, that morphing process, and how you feel about your main character and how she compares to you.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we begin with, I mean, I do, and I hear you saying the same thing, with something in your personal life that's really charged and resists comprehension or rational comprehension, and there's just, I think, as a writer, this dissatisfaction with letting things just not make sense, which is very frustrating. And I was speaking to another Iranian writer, Amir Ahmadiarian, and we were just joking with each other, but we were being very serious that it's like writing is like a disease. You just wish you would wake up one morning and it would just be done, because
Take a pill.
you're just picking at these wounds all day long, and but then they do transform, and they do change, and they morph into something completely unexpected. And so I started with kind of that really difficult incident of something that happened to my brother that I witnessed, and that was kind of our landing in America, even though I was born in the United States, and then we left rather quickly, and so I have this experience also of being both a citizen and an immigrant. And that incident did derail a lot of things for us as a family, and it also seemed symbolic of things that had been derailed before it actually happened to me, or for me. I was like, there were other things that led to this happening, and then things that happened since refer back to it constantly. But I think part of it was because there was no accountability in that incident. Like the person was just kind of let off the hook, and the school wasn't accountable. There was nobody to really place blame on or responsibility on. And so it stayed this unresolved thing that I needed to investigate. And then the book kind of came out of that. It was, even though really once you get past the first 30 pages, that piece kind of disappears.
Yeah. But it forms the whole story because of its violence, and it's the violence of it's.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's that kind of, I feel language is very much alive, and it's its own consciousness, its own being. And I can have certain ideas about what I want to write about. And when I sit down to write, the language just appears and does things that I didn't expect. And it's so joyful to go with it into the mystery. If I knew exactly everything that was going to happen start to finish, it would be a very dead book. And oftentimes as a writer, that the book has a life of its own when it becomes strange to you and unfamiliar, or has its own compulsions and obsessions. And this was very much like that. Like there are so many pieces and parts of it that are very far from life. You know, the walls shift in the apartment and the walls bleed and there's a lot of horror.
Yeah.
There's also a lot of pleasure. I mean,
yeah. So, but once you do finish your draft, and do you find that when you want to publish, you have an editor, does the editor, say, well, can you please make this make a little more sense? Have an editor like that,
yeah.
Self having to do that and then feeling like you may be damaging that initial right.
No, I don't worry about that very much because I have an editor that I really trust and who tends to be inclined to just point out when things aren't clear or developed enough and is respectful. She doesn't try to change the story itself. Although I think it's important for editors to push back sometimes as well, to kind of help shape something. And, this is a novel that one could say is a narrative, not a story, because it's so open-ended and so close to life. And it's the real plot of the novel is the thinking and the conversation and this tracking of violence in language. So it's not, there aren't things happening constantly that push these characters around. Things have happened in the past and they're just processing them, right? So it's a very quiet book in that regard. And I think, I wouldn't write another novel like this, right? And another novel, I would want it to have this kind of arc and pressure of a story. And there I would really rely on my editor to say, there isn't enough tension or energy here.
I understand. Yeah. All right, I was dying to ask you that question. So do you feel that, I believe very strongly that for people who have experienced trauma, whether it be historical, personal, that writing, finding the words to describe it, I think for most people, they say, well, whatever trauma has happened to you, you need to blow through it and move forward and leave it behind and create something. But in fact, there's now evidence that that's not exactly the right way to handle trauma. Veterans are now talking about post-traumatic growth rather than post-traumatic trauma, and that it's not fixed, that in fact while it never will leave you and the pain may never leave, there are things you can do by examining it and exposing yourself to it, which is what I think she's doing here. This character, and I love that, and I hope that a lot of readers will explore their own trauma or learn how to explore their own trauma in some ways by reading this artist's story. So the last thing I wanted to ask you, well, there's two things. You speak 4 languages. Is English the one that you feel most comfortable writing in, or was that a conscious choice, or did it just happen? Because English is not the most I don't know, sometimes I think English is just really limited. So.
Yeah, it's the language that I feel I have the most complete command of. And I actually love writing in English because I think it's a very flexible language. The units of grammar are very basic. So subject, verb, object. And I find I can stretch it and think in Farsi or think or feel in Spanish, but write in English. And I think that's part of the circularity of my narrative too, is that the emotional register is often pushing the limits of the language pretty far. And so, yeah, it's, I don't know, not necessarily I don't know. The language here is also simple and direct, though. I feel like it's more the structure as a whole, with all the spiraling and the returning, that is a little bit less.
It's nice to have another language in your head, or another few languages in your head. And I feel like it can enrich. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I agree completely. I mean, it's there. It's always informing
Right.
what you're writing. Yeah.
So the Spanish side of you, and I think of that as being another sort of mixed heritage that you have, or part of your mixed heritage, because you spent a great deal of time there in Spain before, well, I guess after you were in Iran. Your parents fled there, but then you were born in the States, and then after your brother's attack, you went to Iran, and then you left Iran because of the situation with the Basij, well, basically the morality police. And your mom, I swear, is there at least one Iranian woman in every family who made somebody move that gun from the barrel of the gun? Because my mother-in-law says she did that too, where some crazy guy with a gun, one of these militia guys came to her door. In your case, you guys were in prison for your mom having let her scarf drop. And she finally got so frustrated, and my mother-in-law did too. And this guy was at her door, and she just took the barrel of his gun and pressed it against her chest and was like, "Shoot me, go ahead." And they just freak out, and eventually they either walk away or let it go. So anyway, so the Spain thing, the last thing that you talk about is in this book, or the last thing that where Arzu is in Andalusia, which is southern Spain. And she, by looking at the architecture and the way that, and thinking about the ancient history of that place, where the Jews and the Muslims were tortured and were ostracized, or actually more than that, they were kicked out of the region, they were driven out, and there was genocide. I know, Persis, I see that you want to start going to questions. This is my last question. So this issue of writing about violence and manipulation perpetrated by one man, and then you go to Andalusia after she's left Marbella, and you are, or she is, Arzu, is talking about history and the violence perpetrated by male-dominated governments and institutions, religions, families. They're not so different, are they?
Yeah, they aren't. And I think that's kind of part of the joy of where the novel landed for me. And the difficulty of it is this widening the aperture from this very personal story.
Yeah.
This, of these two, the narrator's life, the best friend's life, and to the historical and political context of those lives, and then to the kind of deep past of the Andalusian landscape, and understanding, in the process that Jewish communities and Islamic communities were, tortured and sent into exile from southern Spain and displaced, and that over time, we have come to a situation in Palestine and Israel where, Jewish communities that were displaced and were, in terrible danger were told, here's a land, and this concept of a land without a people and a people without a land, which is always a lie and a story of obvious, like, pretend tabula rasa so that occupation can unfold, that there's links between all of these episodes and events. So in a sense, these two women feel that their stories really maybe began, like if they were to trace them back in deep time, in southern Spain, which, you know, it's a weird thing for them to think, but it's also about nested histories and these personal stories nesting in these larger historical stories, and the fact that our stories aren't contained within the boundaries of the nations that we come from, because the nation's boundaries are pretty recent, right? And your ancestors, it's not relevant to your ancestry. But yeah, I'll leave it at that. And
I adored that ending. That was, I mean, Andalusia is one of my favorite places. It's so beautiful, and the Alhambra and all that. It was just, it worked. Just telling you, in my opinion, it really worked. So.
Thank you. Yeah, the ending was, it took, you know, it's a claustrophobic road to get there, but hopefully there's a great release at the end.
So I'm going to hand this over, I guess, to Persis.
Yes, Arzu's dog is in need of some medical attention, so we're going to wrap it up with any questions that you might all have. If you
It's
want,
my dog, not.
That's your fault. You shouldn't have named it with an A.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's the AZ that got me. Anyway, Azareen's dog needs some medical attention. So we're going to try and give you all any opportunity to ask questions. So if you want to unmute yourself, raise your hand, we'll call on you. Or if you want to put any question in the chat. Any questions?
Everybody's a dog person. They want.
Okay, Sahel, who's our intern, asks, which authors inspire your work? What was the hardest part in writing Call Me Zebra?
Yeah, a lot of different authors I find inspiration in, but there are a couple that are really important to me, like James Baldwin's work is really crucial for me, and Toni Morrison is another writer that I really love. And I don't know, the list is so long, you know. I think of all the writers that were referenced inside Call Me Zebra, all the literature, the history of Catalan literature and Anglo-Saxon literature and Italian literature. I mean, yeah, like Calvino is a writer I'm really fond of, Mercè Rodoreda, and that is also the hardest, that was the hardest part of writing Call Me Zebra, was that I had to do so much reading and so much research so that I could begin to tie together these literary histories that exist in the journey that Zebra makes, you know, from Iran to Turkey to New York City to Spain and then back again. So that was, it took a lot of research and a lot of note taking and tracking.
Yeah, thank you, because I loved that novel for its wide reach of both history and literary history. And I think it suggested to me that you had indeed done a lot of reading. That's an ambitious thing to take on, right? So
yeah. Always reading.
Yeah, there's another question from Joan, who says, this is a fascinating conversation, and regarding healing from trauma, you mentioned distance and time as well as friendship support. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very personal question. So the things that work for one person might not for another, but I think, you know, therapy is really critical and can be very helpful, and is not something that I never thought that it was, there was a ton of openness to it in the community, especially elders. There's a lot of stigma around it, but I think it's a wonderful tool for understanding and finding clarity. And speaking of dogs, I mean, I think animals actually can really, you know, animals and nature can really deepen our sense of empathy, our spiritual practices, just our ability to practice being present in the world. But art is another form of, yeah, telling stories, writing stories, painting, anything that kind of allows you to express parts of your subconscious thinking or your mind. But I don't know. I mean, I'm sure others have thoughts. It's such a personal question.
Is there any other questions? I'm gonna ask a question a little bit about the work you're doing in your capacity as a teacher and as the curator, founder of this symposium on literatures of annihilation, exile, and resistance. I wonder if you see the conversation shifting now in the last couple of years, because I observe that it has indeed shifted, whereby some of those stories that have been either marginalized or suppressed, people of color, Black people, Indigenous narratives, are gaining more visibility because we're in this unique moment. And I wonder if that is something that feels new to you too, in terms of, like in a university setting, or if in some ways we're just able to amplify it because of something as prominent as, the murder of this man, George Floyd, that kind of awakened something in us collectively. I mean, and I wouldn't think it would be such an overstatement to say that it was a global context in which we observed that. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that idea of the awakening attention to history and the violence of state-sanctioned violence in particular is more prominent now than it was a few years ago.
Well, I think that people who have been doing the work of activism and addressing the errors in history have been doing the work for generations or decades, and it's the rest of the people who have been maybe dislodged from the actual work on the ground that are coming into awakening. And I think the moment is shifting because of the nature of technology and the fact that these instances of police brutality against Black and brown bodies can be recorded now and shared almost simultaneously as they're happening. And I think that does allow for a certain denial to be pierced through, and also for people who aren't in denial but who understood maybe police violence on an abstract level, or hadn't really seen it, and see the injustice of it and the disproportion with which the violence is being deployed, to kind of make those connections and come out in solidarity. And of course, like, the pandemic accelerated and amplified everything. It also, I think, is a moment of deep reflection, cultural reflection and reckoning that I hope will continue, past this moment. I agree. I think we are in a pivotal shift, but I think it's important for me to acknowledge that the work that led to the pivotal shift didn't happen overnight. It's been ongoing, right? And it's maybe that there are more ears tuned into it. And so for Literatures of Exile, we host a series where we're just trying to understand, this question of how does violence affect language? How does it affect the way that we document and tell our stories? And how does it affect, our sense of collective identity? So we've hosted, we do try to focus heavily on Middle Eastern and North African writers, because we feel that that's kind of a vacuum in the literary landscape. I mean, that's changing too. But, the Middle East gets spoken about a ton in media, but our own voices don't get heard very often. And I'm really committed to leveraging whatever I can leverage in my own writing life to kind of amplify more voices, and also to find community for myself and to be in conversation with other writers. So it's a monthly webinar, and I think the link is up here. There's a listserv. We really encourage everyone to spread the word, and anybody can come to our webinars and can join the listserv. We had this amazing event with a writer from Gaza last month, and it was extraordinary to be able to be in conversation with him from across, the world. And we have people who join from Barcelona and London and Bahrain. So it's a really cool thing that I'm excited about.
Zoom didn't cancel it, huh?
Zoom? No, we actually decided that we will be staying on Zoom for as long as we're running it for equity purposes and accessibility, because so much of our community is diaspora, global diaspora, and also homeland communities. So yeah, we're just going strong with the webinar.
Any other questions? We're going to let Azareen go in about 5 minutes. So this will be your last chance. I guess I'll ask you one question about that, the whole context of your brother, or the Arazu's brother. Sometimes it's so easy to say everything is truthful when it might be fictionalized, but I noticed that you had a blurb from our friend Neda Makbouleh on your book, and it sort of suggested to me that there's more representation and conversation about the issues around how Iranians have experienced a form of both subtle and overt racism in recent years, particularly after the last president. And I wonder if that also, the idea of representing things like that in fiction, gives, to speak to your point about language, gives a sort of tangible name to some of these things that we have lacked in the past.
Yeah, Neda's work has been really important to me in basically validating my experiences of growing up here, but also, my aunt who came here in the 80s, just, I think the racism was really brutal during the hostage crisis toward Iranians, and then maybe it subsided a little bit in the 90s, and then after 9/11 it kind of steadily grew, and yeah, with the Trump era, that it all just became a lot worse or more concentrated. So I'm definitely trying to draw attention to those issues for sure.
Teresa.
I wrote my question.
Sorry?
I wrote my question in the chat. Would you like me to read it out, or?
Sure, go ahead.
It's a great question.
Thank you so much for being here, first off. I wanted to just know if in your career you have felt that because you are this Iranian writer, that everything else about you has kind of been removed, and then you've been pigeonholed to be this representative for Iranian literature, and then kind of, I don't want to say forced, but again, pigeonholed to just be that narrator. You can't write about other things or other experiences because, I don't know, maybe that's just not what the West wants to see. So I don't know if you've ever felt that kind of thing in your career.
I personally haven't, but I think it's because my identity is so complicated and complex that it's maybe more than pigeonholed. There is a kind of lack of clarity, right, that I experience in encounters with people who are like, well, where are you from? You're here, you're there, you're this and you're that. And I think, I am Iranian, but I'm also very much just consider myself a transnational or international writer, because I'm writing from multiple sites. Even though a lot of my narrators are Iranian, I'm very careful when I'm doing nonfiction work not to kind of occupy that space of a representative, because we're not one community, and I'm not an ambassador for our community. I'm just, one human. But yeah, I haven't felt pigeonholed. At least I've been very careful not to be put in that position in some ways, I suppose.
Okay, and the last question is from Nason, who says, thank you for the conversation. I was wondering whether you encountered any pushback or resistance to getting this story published.
Not to getting it published, but I think there was pushback and resistance when the reviews came out. There were some rave reviews, and then there were some pretty difficult reviews that were very dismissive. One in particular said that I thought was quite funny, like musings on the Middle East. And that's very much a political gesture of, ambivalence or even diminishing, of a very complicated story. And those were anonymous reviews. They were trade reviews. So of course, easy to kind of get away with. But I think that it's a difficult book. I think it's a book that requires a very particular appetite, and it's quite unruly in terms of its aesthetics and its structure. It's not following a linear path, and it's not event driven. So it's not a book that's entertaining, it's a book that's about sitting and thinking and reflecting. And I think there is always resistance to that. But there's also been a lot of incredible conversation and thoughtful, engagement with it. And I feel that that's, ultimately far outweighed the resistance. But the resistance is, anytime women speak about sexual abuse and then you layer it with ethnic dynamics or racial dynamics, Palestine, it's a lot.
Yeah.
But I had to do it, so here it is.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Azareen, for being with us today. And thank you to Suzanne Paris for being your interlocutor. And
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it. And
Thank you.
I want to speak more with you. So if you're in San Francisco, you need to make sure you let me know.
Yes, absolutely. I'd love to meet all of you in person, and thank you again. It was just lovely to be in conversation with you and to be invited to this platform, which I really support and admire the work you're all doing.
It's great. And I can't wait to sign on to your listserv for that organization.
Oh yes, yeah, definitely join us.
Wonderful. That sounds great. I mean, not wonderful, but interesting. So, and I want to thank everybody of my people who I invited, who came along. I really appreciate that. And if you want to share this, I guess it's being recorded and it'll be on YouTube. And
yeah,
let's get more people reading Iranian American literature.
absolutely. And on that note, I'm going to end with not literature, but inviting you all to come next Thursday at 4:30. We're doing a foodways talk about the importance of yogurt in the history, culture, and cuisine of Iran and the diaspora. And you can find the link in our Instagram to sign up to register for that. And it's with our foodways researcher volunteer. His name is Dr. Nader Mehravari, who's a retired chemical engineer or chemist, I can't remember, who has made it his mission to explore and share the importance of cuisine in transmitting Iranian culture outside of Iran. And so we're going to talk with him about yogurt and make yogurt and talk about all the things you can do with yogurt. So if you're feeling inclined to move from the literary to the culinary, next week is your moment. So join us then. And thank you again to both of you for being here, Azareen, and good luck with your dog.
Thank you.